a lot of us work with people who are very experienced, and some of their errors are fossilized. And I wanted to ask how much you think that drilling certain items, lexical chunks, how much do you think that is useful for people of great experience in the classroom?
That's a good question. That's a good question. It's difficult, isn't it? Because by and large, aviation professionals, they hold fairly high status in the societies that they come from. They are well respected. They are quite often in command of multi-million dollar or pound machines, and they have great responsibility and know a lot about the world, and of course know a lot about their subject area and their profession. And here we are, language teachers, doing what can be fairly rudimentary language drills, trying to drill out or treat fossilized language error in classrooms using the basic toolkit of the language teacher, which will be things like drills. How do you work with that? How do you strike that balance between treating with respect and the students that we are working with, and yet at the same time recognizing that they need remedial support with language? And I think a lot of that comes from developing strong relationships with those you're working with. I mean, fostering a positive learning environment and a supportive, trusting atmosphere in which making mistakes, maybe as foolish in other situations, wouldn't be regarded as foolish in a classroom. And I think a lot of this is down to helping learners recognize that they do need remedial support, and that their willingness to engage in the sorts of things that you mentioned there, Paul, drilling and working with fossilized error, needs to come from them rather than necessarily feeling like they're being dictated to by language teaching professionals. Very, very difficult question to answer. A range of techniques I find useful. Drilling is useful. Having little posters up on the wall with an example of the error and just being able to point to the poster rather than say the same thing again like a scratch record, I've found to be useful. Inviting colleagues to perform those corrective roles themselves rather than the teacher, again, all essential tools in the teacher's toolkit. Turning to another point that you mentioned in your questions from last week, I think you mentioned something to do with meaning and how to treat error in meaning. Is that correct? Yeah. Again, I feel like I'm giving unsatisfactory answers to your questions, but the error in meaning is a very interesting one. And I think we all have a subjective understanding of where error does clog up a message to the point that transmission of meaning is no longer achieved. As teachers, we can get hung up on errors which don't affect meaning. One very good example of that is a third person S's on verbs, the he does issue, or perhaps use of regular or irregular verbs in past tenses, or things which don't necessarily impede the quality of the communication, but we'll treat them anyway. And then perhaps more significant errors, more global errors, perhaps left untreated, and being able to strike that balance is a very difficult thing. Again, I'll come back to one of the greatest problems that we face in aviation English, and that is the lack of research, the lack of corpus data. We simply don't know on the radio, in the use of plain English as opposed to RT phraseology, we don't know with any sort of hard data to support our knowing what it is that causes misunderstanding. However, there are research moves in applied linguistics and English language teaching which I think we can and should draw upon, hone and focus upon this area as we conduct our work. There is a practitioner, I think she works at a university in Austria, called Seidelhofer, and she did some work in 2003 and has worked quite closely with Jennifer Jenkins looking at a lingua franca core. not only from the point of view of pronunciation and what elements of pronunciation may interfere with understanding in an international context, but also looking at lexicogrammar and looking at which words and particularly the way words are used. Also looking at grammatical structure and grammatical form, and looking at discourse patterns more broadly as well. And I think some of the work they are trying to do is looking at spoken language and trying to boil down a set of basic fundamental principles in the use of English lexis and structure, which is teachable in a similar way to Jenkins' approach on phonology. It's got to be teachable. There's no point in having data unless we can apply it in our classroom practice, Paul. I think what we need to do is to use our intuition and treat errors, particularly as regards the target language, which of course from a communicative approach to language teaching, you're teaching something specific and concrete, and that should be the language that is treated in terms of error correction in the classroom. And we ought to use our intuition to a certain extent. We need to let go of particular errors which don't interfere with meaning. But until we've got a solid corpus that has empirical evidence for what it is we do, I'm afraid we're just stabbing in the dark to a certain extent.
Yes, I really agree. I think the corpus is going to be a big help when it arrives.
Yes.
I wonder who's working on it.
There's been talk, I think both the ICAO World Forum and Mike McGrath's forum, Flight English, about the development of a corpus. Professor Charles Alderson at the University of Lancaster approached this quite warmly. He's looking, I don't know if this is the sort of information I should be sharing around, but I know that he has students that are currently looking at air traffic control transcripts with a view to trying to pull out these key areas of language, both lexis, structure, phonology. But of course that might not necessarily help us work out what goes to make something essentially understandable and what elements of that message need to be absent in order to make it unintelligible. I think that's perhaps something a little different, but the corpus will certainly help.